The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is getting a live action film targeted at adults. It is going to be adapting what, from my understanding, is the very violent graphic novel series, The Last Ronin. And here's how Wikipedia summarizes kind of the premise of The Last Ronin, saying, quote, "The story follows characters from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise in an alternative future wherein the last remaining turtle seeks to avenge the death of his brothers by killing the grandson of one of the Turtles' arch enemies, the Shredder," end quote. And from my understanding, this was a very successful graphic novel series. So it makes sense that they would want to adapt it. But again, what feels really interesting about this is that this is going to be an R-rated live-action Ninja Turtles adaptation for adults specifically. And in a lot of ways, this feels like Logan. You know, like the X-Men film. It has a lot of similarities, and not just on one level. So on one level, story-wise, like this idea of kind of like one of the last surviving of a group, and they're trying to avenge or kind of go on this journey, and like especially notably like kind of like almost as a loner. Another similarity is like this just general conception, you know, and not just of the film Logan, but then also the graphic novel was based on Old Man Logan, right? So this conception of a darker, more personal take on a comic franchise primarily targeted at children. And I know that's controversial to say. I don't want to make it sound like, you know, you're being immature if you like these things, but ultimately they are liked by both children and adults, but there are things that can only be appreciated by adults because of like the nature of the content, right? And then it being R-rated, right? That there's this, you know, it really is, I think, an indication of Hollywood and the entertainment industry rethinking what the best way is to adapt existing intellectual property, right? And this is a question, or maybe debate is the better word, that goes on constantly. You see it with things like superhero films. You see it with like Star Wars. This idea, this clash between people wanting these things to be darker, more mature, and then people on the other end going, they're for children. You know, like, it's okay that you grew up, but the things you liked as a kid don't have to grow up with you. Again, this question of should children's media be reinvented for adults? And I'm not sure. I'm always of the mind that it doesn't need to be mature in the sense that it would be inappropriate for a child to watch it. I'm always of the mind to make it more mature in the sense that the psychological realities of the characters is more nuanced. You know, so it's not just dealing with very surface level, rudimentary thematic ideas, but, you know, wrestling with really more complicated human questions that I think the best children's media does already, right? So I don't need Star Wars to be R-rated. I need Star Wars to feel psychologically and thematically satisfying beyond just a simple good versus evil, which I do like, but how can you deepen that? Not that you're making it more complicated, but how do you deepen those rudimentary surface level thematic ideas, right? And again, this has been done. Like we talked about with Logan. In a sense, Joker, like Batman's always been dark, but again, this idea of like, we're going to make it more of like an R-rated, like an actual movie, not like those comic book movies. And the example I always find hilarious is the transition from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, in terms of the books, not the movies, but so The Hobbit came out first in like the late 30s, and then the Lord of the Rings trilogy was in like the early mid 50s. The original Hobbit book was very much a children's book. In its tone, in its accessibility, in its content. Lord of the Rings is very dense, complicated, often violent. It's not that kids can't read it, but it's not really for children. And the joke I saw once was like, the transition from The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings is like the transition. It would be like if 20 years after Charlotte's Web, the author wrote a sequel series where the nephew of Wilbur goes on a journey to kill the devil, right? Like it seemed that's what it would be like, though, right? So that we've already seen creators themselves reinvent the tone of their own universe, right? And I think ultimately the best of these, like, it's about people wanting to project maturity onto the material. So it's like they want to keep the way something is, like Star Wars is, again, a great example. They just want to keep Star Wars the way it is, but have people say fuck and have graphic violence, right? Rather, I think what's a better artistic decision is to pull the existing psychological maturity out of the material. So that it's already there, it just isn't being capitalized on, right? So this is a very short story. I'm basically have said everything I wanted to say about this. This is really not that big of a deal, but I thought that this was an interesting development, because of all the things to get a like mature R-rated adaptation, this feels like the least likely. And maybe that's, again, my ignorance, because this has already been a graphic novel series and this is not new necessarily, although it's very recent. I think it's like 2020, like only a couple years ago. But Ninja Turtles has always had this air, even though the original comics were a lot more edgy and darker. The conception everyone has is the 80s animated show, which notably was way more targeted to young children. So it just feels very strange. And not in a bad way, but just strange that of all of the properties to kind of get the R-rated, adult adaptation treatment, it's gonna be the Ninja Turtles. So, I'm very interested to see anything about it. Maybe I'll go read the graphic novel, but only time will tell.